Hey, welcome to Chapter 11, the Renaissance. Your chapter objectives are that you should be able to contrast medieval and Renaissance attitudes toward life, list the major Renaissance writers, painters, sculptors, architects, and musicians, as well as their major works, contrast the characteristic styles of medieval and Renaissance art, and discuss positive and negative results of the Renaissance. This lecture will be done as an entire group, so all of Chapter 11 will be one video. It will not be split up in the way that it has in the past. Okay, your vocabulary words for this chapter: humanism, humanities, patrons, frescoes, perspective, plainsong, motets, chansons, polyphonic, and genre painting. Okay, so I'd like you guys to take a look at your textbook at this point in time. Open it up to page 255 and just kind of skim through the book. Look at the chapter. These are the headings for the entire chapter. There's only 3 sections. You can access your PDP Cornell Notes template on course sites. So if you want to type into your notes for this first section, you can. Or an even better idea would be for you to look at the template and handwrite the questions and then go ahead and write out your answers. So predict at the bottom there, your prediction statement. I predict that blank will cause blank because blank, once you've spent a few minutes skimming through the material. Remember that skimming is not actively reading. You're not taking notes. You're not highlighting anything in the book. You're just looking at the pictures and the captions, the subheadings, okay? You want to know what this chapter is about, what kind of material, what kind of people, what stories you might encounter. Okay, characteristics of the Renaissance. We need to contrast the Renaissance with the Middle Ages so you can see why there's a divide between these 2 time periods. Okay. The Renaissance is considered a rebirth. That's what Renaissance means. It's French for rebirth. And what is it a rebirth of? It's a rebirth of learning, of the arts, of culture. Okay, we've talked about in the medieval times how education wasn't very widespread. It was mostly kept within the church, so mostly monks, priests were the people that were pursuing education. Remember that during the Middle Ages, they're also known as the Dark Ages. People are really just trying to survive. They're struggling on an everyday basis to eat, to not be killed in some raids by some rival kingdom. Okay, what happens during the Renaissance is we kind of get a period of peace. The kind of bridges that gap between Middle Ages and Renaissance that allows for people to become very interested in learning and culture. And we've seen that before, right? This is one of those cycles and trends in history, okay, where you have people, civilization as a whole, when it's at war, can't focus as much on all of the pretty things like art and literature and music. Okay, and then when you get into a time of peace and prosperity, they have time to look at those things and to develop them. Okay, remember that before we went on Christmas vacation, we had the Crusades. So a lot of Europeans have been to the Middle East. Remember that part, if we talk about the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire, remember when the fall of Rome happened, the Byzantine Empire continued for many years after that, and the Muslim Empire continued to thrive. And they're developing science and mathematics and their own literature. And so when Europeans who've been living in the Dark Ages, okay, come to fight the Crusades in the Middle East, they come into contact with all of this really neat and interesting stuff. Trade will begin to prosper again, so there's going to be more money. Eventually there'll be peace. There's more money to pour into things like art and literature. And so they're going to take some ideas from the Middle East, bring them back to Europe. They're going to find, again, they're going to rediscover classical literature, so things like Aristotle and Socrates and Plato. They're going to be newly interested in biblical texts. Okay, and they're going to bring them back over to Europe and begin to work with these things. Okay, so the Renaissance man sees his time as a drastic break from medieval superstitions and kind of that Dark Ages way of thinking. Okay, the Renaissance man thinks he's living in light. Like, this is just the best thing that could have ever have happened. We don't have to live like we did in the Middle Ages. This is just a completely brand new age. Has nothing to do with the Middle Ages. But really, the Renaissance is a culmination of gradual changes that were made throughout the Middle Ages, because we've talked about that before, right? During the Middle Ages, you'd see, okay, some monks start working with classical text and making sure that they saved those classical texts. Or we talked about the Carolingian minuscule, because now we want to make sure that we're still trying to preserve whatever knowledge that we can get a hold of. So it wasn't like the Renaissance was completely different. It was all of these different things coming together at this point. So that's what culmination means. It's the highest or climactic point of something, especially after a long time period has passed. Okay, it works up to this point. So the Middle Ages all pour into what becomes the Renaissance. So here you have this little chart, this diagram, and you can see the difference between a Renaissance man and a medieval man. The Renaissance man has a zest for living. You might not know what that word means, but it means like great enthusiasm, a lot of energy for living life today. Think about zest. If you know what a zest is on citrus fruit, on like lemon, limes, oranges, if you're cooking, you'll take the outside, that colored part, and you'll put it in something to help flavor it, to give it flavor. And so these words are kind of related. It's giving that brightness, that excitement to living, okay? The medieval man, he's consumed with otherworldly concerns, meaning he cares about what his life's going to be like after he leaves this earth. So what is heaven going to be like? Am I going to go to hell? I need, the welfare of his soul. Does he need to be paying the church for something? Because remember, the Catholic Church kind of is the only church that exists at this point. We're heading into the Reformation, but we're not there yet. You have the work of the church being one of his primary concerns, okay? Because he's working towards, everything is towards his salvation. Remember that a lot of people went on the Crusades because they thought that if they did, they could kind of get a pass into heaven. The Renaissance man will glory in the past. They're going to look at pretty much the classical time period, classical scholars like Aristotle and Socrates and Plato and ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and say, look at what man accomplished during that time period. Wasn't it great? He'll live enthusiastically in the present, and he really doesn't care a lot about the future. He just thinks that the future can take care of itself. Whereas the medieval man is focused on, again, otherworldly things. He's focused on heaven, his future. He's not concerned so much about the here and now or the past. Okay. So there's a focus on man during the Renaissance. A difference between medieval people and Renaissance people is that medieval people praised group achievement, the whole group, the whole church. We did this and that was great. Or whereas the Renaissance is going to praise individual achievement. So this one man did this, so someone like Leonardo da Vinci is great because he painted all of these paintings. He is great, not the church is great, or all of the artists are great, or the school of art that he came from was great. The ideal man during this time has many, many, many diverse talents, and that's what we know as a Renaissance man. You can call someone a Renaissance man today. It's just someone who has a lot of talent in many different areas. So during the Renaissance, that would be someone who's interested in science and in art and in literature and music and all over the place, okay? During the Renaissance, we're going to have a renewed focus on man's capacities and worth. So, men are extremely capable. we'll see some of the same thinking when we make it to the Enlightenment in a few hundred years from now. This is different from humanism today when you talk about secular humanism. Humanists back during the Renaissance period still believed in God. They still went to church, but they really thought that men were able to do so much that they didn't necessarily need God to accomplish these things. Whereas secular humanists today, they don't believe in God. Humanists during the Renaissance time period will also believe that men are inherently good, that at our core we are good, which kind of goes against all the teachings of the Bible, that we definitely are not good at our core, and that's why we need Jesus. So the culture becomes, because of this humanist influence, pretty much devoid of eternal values, biblical ethics, godly living. If you look at places like Venice, Italy becomes pretty much infamous for how immoral the place is, with people just lots of treachery and adultery and intrigue, and just kind of it was kind of what we could consider the Renaissance Sin City, okay? Like the Renaissance Vegas, if you will. Okay, so part of that revival of learning, I already explained to you guys before, is because there's an expansion of trade, mostly due to the Crusades. Government is changing. Government, because the feudal system is actually kind of falling away, and people are living in towns, and we have these town governments, and now we need people who know how to run these town governments. So we need educated laymen who have professional skills. So they're going to want to be educated. They're going to want to attend universities and schools. So you get the birth of the humanities or liberal arts. Okay, and this is just kind of a well-rounded study of history, science, grammar, philosophy, classical literature. For example, since I was a history major, my degree is in history. I graduated from the College of Liberal Arts at UNLV. Within the College of Liberal Arts, you can major in history, you can major in English, you can major in any of many of the languages, you can major in philosophy, sociology, I think is still in there. Psychology, I still believe, is within the liberal arts college, okay? And if it's not right now, it once was. And again, humanities and liberal arts, this is kind of off topic for the Renaissance, but if you decide to take AP US History next year, what you're doing for college is that you are going to knock out 6 credits of courses in this area, and that doesn't mean that you would major in that area. Almost all colleges are going to require you to complete some classes in this area because they want well-rounded students. All right, moving on. So those who study the humanities are known as humanists. This is different from humanism that we talked about in the last slide, okay? And humanists are going to consider ignorance the root of evil. If we know things, then there won't be evil. We can avoid evil. They praise the ancients. Remember, we talked about that already too. Ancient Romans, ancient Greeks, especially Cicero. They loved Cicero. And that's because Cicero was a scholar. He was a lawyer, a statesman. He was a master of literary expression. So he's kind of a pre-Renaissance man. Okay. So let's go over the SRQ for this section. What is the name of the period during the 14th through 16th centuries of European history in which learning and arts revived and flowered? You should pause it here. Try to come up with the answer on your own. Okay? It would be a really good idea if you wrote these on a piece of paper that you attached to your notes. Hint, hint. Okay? Also, bonus question for your vocabulary quiz tomorrow is going to be, what am I scared of? I am scared of robots and bunnies. So the answer to question number 1 is the Renaissance. which means rebirth in French. Okay, define humanism. A renewed focus on man's worth and capabilities. What new course of study became popular in Europe during the Renaissance? What subject disciplines were included in this course of study? Humanities, history, grammar, classical literature, art, science. What was the goal of Renaissance education? To develop well-rounded individuals. And what period of history did the Renaissance humanists admire? They admired the classical age of ancient Greece and Rome. Here are your paragraph shrink focus words. You have 4, Renaissance, rebirth, learning, medieval. Okay, so you're trying to sum up this section to illustrate what you've learned. You want to keep it short. Try to keep it to 20 words or less. You may use different forms of the words. So, learning could be learn, could be learned. Okay, could be just learn. Medieval, I'll allow you to say Middle Ages, Dark Ages if you choose to. Okay, so at this point you can stop the video. You can mark where you stopped it so that when you come back to it, you know that you ended section 1. Moving on into section 2. Go ahead and open up your textbooks to page 257. Okay, look through pages 257 to 263. Skim them, check out the pictures. Get an idea of what we're going to talk about, and this is the outline for section 2, Course of the Renaissance. So you have thought and literature. We're going to talk about writers during this section. Look and see if you see any important vocabulary terms that jump out at you, maybe words that you don't know in the text. Note those words. Okay, it's important that when you see a word that you don't know, you look it up. You all have dictionaries on your computer. Use them. Vocabulary is very important when it comes to test taking, when you take your SATs, if you take AP classes, when you go to take the AP exams. Very, very important. Okay, so the Renaissance begins in Florence, Italy. And there's the church. This picture is the church in Florence. The dome, and we'll talk about, there was a contest to who was going to create this dome, and we'll discuss that later on in this chapter. Italians led the Renaissance for a few reasons. One, they thought of themselves as Romans, and remember that during the Renaissance, people are looking back at the classical age and ancient Greece and Rome and talking about how wonderful those time periods were and how much people knew, and they're kind of trying to model themselves after that. So that's one of the reasons why the Italians will lead the Renaissance. They control trade and wealth. Remember, they have a lot of merchants, especially the Venetian merchants that are going across the Mediterranean to the Middle East to get goods to trade in Europe. So people have become very, very wealthy in Italy, and so these very wealthy people have commissioned artists to design buildings, to decorate churches, to carve statues. They have money to pour into these things. They want to show off their wealth. You have affluent bankers and merchants becoming the sponsors or patrons of these different artists. And affluent means wealthy, if you guys don't know that word. Patrons, that's a vocab term for you, but patrons are these supporters of these artists. They kind of just give them money so that they can create their art. So they're helping pay for supplies, and sometimes they're paying, for these people to eat. They're like their bosses, and they commission these works of art. Some of the most famous patrons were the Medicis in Italy. Lorenzo de' Medici is known as Il Magnifico. He puts a lot of money into commissioning artists to kind of help decorate his family's homes and whatnot. Okay, so let's focus on thought and literature. The first group we're going to look at are the Italian humanist writers. The first one is Petrarch. He is known as the father of Renaissance humanism. And he has, hold on a second, sorry. His father wants him to study law, but Petrarch doesn't really want to do that. And we've seen this before with some religious figures, people like St. Francis, okay? He doesn't want to enter law school, but he does anyway. But he really enjoys studying the classical writings of Greece and Rome. His dad doesn't like that. One day his dad even throws some of his copies of these texts into the fire, and they have a big fight. Eventually, after his father dies, though, Petrarch gives up his study of law, and he just completely devotes his life to studying the classics. He composes his own Latin poems, and he will write things in the vernacular of the people. So, in Italian, he's writing things in the language of the people, the language that he speaks every day. Because you don't run around Italy at this point in time speaking Latin. It's developed into Italian. He has this woman that he's in love with, known as Laura, that he'll write all of these different poems for. There's a little snippet of a poem on page 258 at the bottom if you guys want to check that out. And so just know for your exam, he'll probably show up as a matching, that he is known as the father of Renaissance humanism. Then we have Castiglione. He pretty much just writes books on manners. Remember, people have a lot more wealth. They're trying to show off their wealth. And we need, a code to the way that we behave to kind of set us apart to show how wealthy we are. And so he writes a book of manners. And then we have Machiavelli. He's probably the most important out of this small group here. You're going to have a discussion post that asks you some questions about some ideas that he had. Specifically this one, that it's safer to be feared than to be loved. He wrote in this book called The Prince. And back then in Italy, it was very divided. People were fighting a lot. Different kingdoms were fighting back and forth. Different families. Just think about, if you know anything about Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, the family feud, okay, in that play, because Romeo and Juliet is set in Italy, okay. And so he really thinks about government, and he writes a few works. And The Prince is especially controversial because it has these ideas like it's much safer to be feared than loved. If it is easier for the state to achieve its goals by lying, then they should lie. They shouldn't always have to be truthful. So he promotes the secular state, meaning that he's promoting government that is not necessarily controlled by the church. It kind of stands on its own. And it's not all kind of controversial things that he proposes. We actually get some of our own philosophy on government from him. Pretty much checks and balances and the division of power we kind of not directly take from him, but we've kind of expanded upon. So your discussion posts will have to deal with that if you choose to do that from the learning menu. Okay, so here's a little map. It's in your textbook too. And it just kind of shows you which artists and which writers came from which countries and which areas in Europe during the Renaissance. Okay, so let's get to the Northern humanist writers. When we're talking about Northern, let me flip back. We are talking about not in Italy, pretty much. We're talking about the Holy Roman Empire, so more like Germany. We're talking about England, okay, the Netherlands. And these writers are going to have a greater interest in religious issues than their Italian counterparts. The first one we're going to talk about is Erasmus. He writes The Praise of Folly, which is a satire. A satire is kind of the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices. It's especially used in the context of politics and other kind of topical issues, sometimes with the church, right? You can have a satire. If you ask me in class, you remind me, I can try to show you some examples of satire. A few years ago, the seniors did a class project for English where they made satires on different topics, and there's one that's really funny about Facebook that I can show you guys. Erasmus creates a new edition of the Greek New Testament, which will actually be used by Martin Luther, so it's very influential in the Protestant Reformation, and he's an advocate of church reforms. And if you look on page 260, there's illustrations from The Praise of Folly. Okay, now we have Sir Thomas More. He's a very pious man. He writes the book Utopia. And usually when we talk about utopia, that means like a perfect place. The word literally means no place, so we know that there is no perfect place. When asked about why he was going to be involved in politics, he answered, if better men did not go into politics, worse ones would. He served Henry VIII, but was beheaded for treason after he refused to recognize Henry as the head of the church. So he was a devout Catholic. He's actually a saint. He's been sainted by the Catholic Church. There's actually a church in town called St. Thomas More. And we'll talk more about Henry VIII in the next chapter. We don't get to discuss the Tudors in a lot of detail this chapter, but we will next chapter, and they're very, very interesting and exciting. So I can't wait till we get there. Okay, Cervantes, he is from Spain. He writes Don Quixote, which is very famous. If you haven't heard about it, it's a satire on chivalry, that code of chivalry we've talked about. Remember knights? I don't know if you guys if you haven't heard of it, or maybe this might trigger your memory. It's where he is fighting windmills because he thinks they're like these big monsters, right? Okay, he's kind of delusional, kind of wacky, but or Don Quixote is not Cervantes. Okay, we also have Shakespeare, which we all know is one of the most famous, greatest playwrights and English poets. And he's not a writer, but I wanted you guys to pay attention to him. Gutenberg, he puts the movable type printing press into use in Europe. Because remember that movable type printing had been developed in China before, but we now start using it in Europe. So he's printing Bibles. The cost of books drops dramatically. Remember, people aren't handwriting them, so there's not as many errors. People can buy texts now with the printing press as well. When we get to music, you'll see people start to buy music so that they can play in their own homes. So this helps stimulate the growth and the spread of ideas as well as education. Okay, here's your SRQ check. Remember, you guys should probably write these questions down. A lot of these become quiz questions if you haven't noticed. Apart from the church, what family was the most famous patron of Renaissance learning and art, and who was the most noted patron of this family? Try to answer on your own. Okay, the Medicis and Lorenzo de' Medici, El Magnifico. Who is called the father of humanism because he led the way in reviving interest in study in classical literature? Hold on 2 seconds, guys. Okay, that answer there is incorrect. I don't know why that's there. It should be Petrarch. So I apologize for that. So make sure that you know Petrarch. And I'll know if you listen to the lecture now if you get this question wrong. What contribution did Johannes Gutenberg make to European history? It's the movable type printing press. What work of Erasmus did later reformers and Bible translators use? That's the Greek New Testament. And what Englishman is generally considered the greatest playwright of all time? Shakespeare. Okay, so here, even though the section isn't over entirely, we're going to pause, and I want you guys to write a paragraph shrink using the focus words writers, focused, classics, differed. If you're doing this over the course of a few days, this would be a good point to pause. Take note of the time where you stop the video so you can come back to it later. Okay, so this is the visual arts section of section 2, Course of the Renaissance. This looks a little intimidating because there are many artists that we're going to talk about, and the funny thing is this doesn't even come close to the amount of famous artists that were at their peak during the Renaissance. So just take a look. If you look in your notes, you'll see that I kind of took each section and I told you these were the painters that you need to know. So I just want you to kind of put with each painter what development you could associate with them, which major works of art you can associate with them. Also looking at this page, at this slide, on your learning menus, one of your entree items is that you're going to create some type of project that deals with one of these people or one of the writers. So this would be a good screen to look at to kind of get an idea, well, maybe I want to do my project on Da Vinci, or maybe I want to do my project on Titian. Okay? And then you can go from there. These are the ones that are available to you, all of the ones that are in the book. Okay? Okay, so this is also kind of big. I know these two slides look intimidating today, right? You should write all of this down because this will be an essay question. Renaissance artists broke with medieval traditions in the following ways. Remember, during this chapter, we're contrasting the medieval ages and the Renaissance. So in art, this is what Renaissance artists are doing differently. Number one, Renaissance art emphasizes the present physical world. Medieval art emphasized the spiritual realm and the life to come in heaven. So we've already kind of talked about that when we talked about the difference between Renaissance man and medieval man. So art is reflecting their lives right now and the things they think about. Number two, secular patrons often supported the Renaissance artists, and during the Middle Ages, the Church of Rome pretty much was the only patron for the artists. They were the ones commissioning the artwork and paying for the artwork. During the Renaissance, you have those wealthy like merchants and bankers paying for art to be made. Number three, most Renaissance artists were extremely proud of their work and wanted their names known and their works praised, where medieval artists, on the other hand, worked primarily for the glory of God and the church, and they usually didn't get any personal recognition. And again, we've already discussed this, right, guys? You have the Renaissance artists. The Renaissance men wanted to be known for individual work, praised individually. Medieval, the group gets the praise, not the individual. Number four, Renaissance artists gave a realistic three-dimensional aspect to their works, and medieval art was flat and two-dimensional. 5, most Renaissance portrait painters frequently painted kings, merchants, and other secular individuals, not necessarily religious. And medieval painters focused on religious leaders and biblical characters and saints, because again, they're being paid to make art by the church. Number 6, painting and sculpture were the most popular media during the Renaissance, and the glory of medieval art really was its architecture, even though there's some Renaissance architecture. So this would be a good time to pause, get all of this down, and then go into the next slides. Okay, so we have early Italian painters. Okay, our first one is Giotto. He's known as the father of Italian Renaissance painting. He's the first to kind of try 3D painting. He doesn't quite master it. His most famous works are frescoes. And frescoes, which was a vocab word, are paintings done on wet plaster. Frescoes are very hard to maintain. So a lot of these, because they're so old, the paint's kind of faded away, has flaked off the walls. He never masters perspective. If you look at this painting, it's really hard in the slideshows for you guys to see these paintings well. But if you look in the slideshow, you can see that Christ, his body there, his torso is kind of huge, and then you look at his feet, they're very small. His legs would be, if you can imagine where his legs would start, they would start somewhere in front of the guy with the greenish, bluish cloak on. They'd be extremely, extremely short. So his body just doesn't line up. There's no perspective. It doesn't really make sense. Okay. The second painter is Masaccio. He used shading to create 3D figures, so we can see the shading in the cloaks of the people. Again, this painting is actually much larger. We're only seeing a little piece of it in this slideshow. Okay, then we finally have Botticelli. He's famous for adding movement to paintings. So you see the movement here. This is just a part of the Birth of Venus, one of his most famous paintings. You see movement in her hair, or you'll see movement in garments that are wispy, moving with the wind. Okay. Early in his career, he paints pagan themes from mythology, like the Birth of Venus. Later on, he'll be influenced by a monk known as Savonarola, who converts Botticelli, and so then his later works will be more religious. He'll be painting Madonnas, and a Madonna is a Virgin Mary, if you didn't know that, is the Mother Mary figure. Speaking of Savonarola, here he is. He's a Dominican friar who tries to bring reform to Florence because it's kind of become so corrupt. So let's move into the High Renaissance now. So High Renaissance meaning like the peak of the Renaissance. The center of culture goes from Florence, moves to Rome, and the church now becomes one of the leading patrons, paying for artists to provide sculptures and doors and domes and paintings for the church. Okay, Da Vinci, probably the Renaissance painter that you guys will most easily recognize. Leonardo da Vinci, he's the ideal Renaissance man. Remember, Renaissance man is someone who's interested in art and science and literature and just everything, okay? Some of his most famous paintings are the Mona Lisa, which you have pictured here, and the Last Supper. And he pretty much, we would consider that Da Vinci is the guy that masters perspective. Just a little side note here, if you look at the Mona Lisa, notice she has no eyebrows. And that was like the fashion of the time. Women would shave off their eyebrows or pluck out their eyebrows. They would actually even pluck back their hairline, because to have a very large forehead was kind of a sign of nobility. It was very attractive. Okay, and if you see that very, very faint little line at the very top of her forehead, that's actually like a little hairnet thing that they would wear. Da Vinci also kept a bunch of technical and scientific designs in a notebook. He came up with one of the first ideas for a helicopter, for life preservers, tanks. I mean, incredibly, incredibly intelligent, creative man. And it's kind of crazy how just ahead of his time he was. Okay, and then we have Raphael, not the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. He painted Madonnas. He's famous for painting Madonnas or the Virgin Marys. He has another painting called the School of Athens that kind of depicts all of the philosophers. Again, if you remind me in class, or if you look it up, you can look it up, just Google the School of Athens, and you can see what that looked like. We have Michelangelo, who was more famous at first for being a sculptor. He was a great sculptor, but he also paints the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which took him a very, very long time, laying on his back on scaffolding. He was originally commissioned only to paint a few figures, and he ends up painting hundreds of figures up on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Okay, so Venetian painters during the late Renaissance, so after that very peak, now it's kind of on the decline, Venice becomes the leading center of culture. So we've seen it go from Florence to Rome to Venice. Okay, remember the Venetians have been very wealthy merchants for many years. They love money and rich clothing and decorations, and you can see this in the art that's being produced. Titian, who's one of my favorite artists, is known for his rich use of color and for his portrait work. This is one of my favorite paintings, and you can't really see it very well. Again, I apologize for it being here. It's called Bacchus and Ariadne. And it's pretty much this mythological story where Ariadne is left pretty much by her boyfriend, and the Roman god Bacchus comes and finds her, and he throws her, like he tries to, I mean, there's several interpretations of this painting, okay? But if you see those leopards here, some are saying he's like going in to protect her, and he throws her crown into, or throws a crown into the heavens, and that becomes a constellation, and you can really, like, hardly see it on this slide. There's little yellow dots up in the sky, and that's the constellation that her crown, or the crown, becomes. But I would definitely look this up. You guys can look it up on your computers and see it in better quality here, or than you can here. Okay, and then you have Tintoretto, who's the little dyer. And that's all we really need to know about him. You're going to match him. Okay, let's move into Northern European artists. Okay, we have Dürer, who is best known for his engravings and woodcuts. Like a woodcut would be something, too, that you could print. So they could roll ink out on a woodcut, and it could end up becoming like a stamp and be reprinted. So people could have those multiple... Those could travel. Everyone could see them. He's the first artist to sign all of his drawings, so he's kind of illustrating that Renaissance focus on the individual and wanting to have that glory and fame for yourself. Then we have Holbein, who was a famous portrait painter. He painted portraits for, that should say Henry VIII. It says Henry VII. Typo, sorry. Erasmus, Sir Thomas More, so the people up there in the English court he's painting portraits for. Then we have Van Eyck. He's one of the first painters to use oil paint, which kind of allows him to create richer, different, like textured color because he could paint differently. He could paint wet to wet, meaning like he doesn't have to wait for, the oil doesn't dry very quickly. It takes a long time to dry the oil paintings, and that kind of helps him develop some of this color. And this is a portrait that Van Eyck did called the Arnolfini portrait, or Arnolfini marriage. It is a portrait that has tons of symbolism, and it's really, really cool when you get into it. This is a horrible quality. You guys can't really see, but the detail of this actual painting is incredible. And you can also look that up. You can Google, like, details Arnolfini marriage or Arnolfini portrait. It's amazing. So he pretty much paints this portrait of these Italians. It's an Italian couple living in a Flemish city in 1434. This is 1434. Think about, like, we know Columbus came in 14 when? Hopefully you know, 1492. This is in 1434. It's early summer. You can tell if you can see out the window. You can't really see here. There's cherry blossoms outside, so we know it's early summer. They're in their reception room. If you look at the whole photograph, there's a bed. That's normal for the time for there to be a bed in the reception room. They are fully dressed because they're trying to show off their wealth. You're thinking it's summer, but they look like they're really hot. Like, why does this woman have all of this clothing on? And it's because they're trying to show off their wealth. There's oranges on that back table. That's another way to show off their wealth. And there's also, it's really, really neat, is that mirror in the back. You see that mirror back there? It shows a reflection kind of the room, and you can technically see the painter. Van Eyck puts himself in there, and he also signs his name right above that mirror. There's a lot of stuff in this picture. I could talk about this painting for a really long time. Okay, the next one is Bruegel. He's a genre painter of scenes from everyday life, so he's painting like peasants and not like official scenes like this one, not official sittings that people sit for a portrait. He's just painting everyday life. People, you know, walking through town. Okay, so let's move into architects and sculptors. The two architects you really want to know about for this chapter are Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. They're rivals. Ghiberti wins this commission to create 22 bronze panels that will be known as the Gates of Paradise. And then finally, Brunelleschi will beat Ghiberti in a competition to build the dome of the cathedral in, that should not say France, it should say Florence. I don't know. I think that was spell check or something. Sorry, guys. And if you see the earlier slides, there's a picture of that dome in Florence that Brunelleschi is responsible for. Okay, then we have Donatello. Realism and expression are kind of his trademarks. He masters the art of sculpting freestanding figures, and a freestanding figure is like the one you see here, okay, of David, where it's all, you can walk around it. He creates the first full-scale equestrian, or like someone on horseback statue since Roman times. Then we have Michelangelo, and you can see one of his famous sculptures, the Pieta, on page 271. This has many contradictions if you really look at it. Christ is physically perfect. He doesn't have any blemishes on him, even though this is depicting him after the crucifixion, right, where he should be very injured. Mary is depicted as a very young girl, even though at the time of Christ's death she would not have been very young. She would have been a middle-aged woman. And she's much, much larger than Christ. And it's even kind of hard to tell that when you look at it in your textbook. You might want to also investigate that online and see if you guys can find some better pictures. Okay, Renaissance music. During the Middle Ages, plain song or Gregorian chant was the most popular type of composition. And I'll put some audio or some YouTube videos of Gregorian chant so you can see what that was like up on course sites. There's actually quite a few videos under your chapter, so you guys can take a look at those. A few of them are horrible histories, and you know how much I like those. The Renaissance music's more secular. It's not as church focused, okay? And that's just like the common theme, right? Renaissance, secular, medieval, religious. Due to the printing press, we already talked about this, more people are buying music, they're trying to play instruments. The lute, and that's a picture of a lute there, becomes the most popular instrument. And more music will be composed and performed during this time period than in any other. Okay, these are the two musicians that you need to know about. Josquin du Pré, he's a Flemish composer. He's best remembered for his masses, so the music that gets sung during the church service, the Catholic church service, his hymns. He creates more than 100 motets, which are unaccompanied Latin songs. And so they kind of are just a variation of the plain song. And he creates chansons, which are lighthearted songs that are set secular lyric poems to music. So it's kind of it's an example of non-religious music. Okay, here's Palestrina. He's the most famous composer of the period. And he's a master of polyphonic music. So when we look at a word like polyphonic, you guys should learn how to, and this is for test taking in the future, learn how to take that word apart. Okay, poly, you should know that means there's many, okay? It's not just two, it's not one, it's not three, it's many, okay? And phonic has to do with music or sound, okay? So he's composing music that consists of many melodies. That's a vocab term. Here's your SRQ check. During the High Renaissance, what city became the culture center of Italy? List the three most famous painters of the High Renaissance period and give the title of one of their masterpieces. Da Vinci, you could say The Last Supper, Mona Lisa. Raphael, The School of Athens. Michelangelo, The Sistine Chapel. What beautiful, wealthy city called the Queen of the Adriatic became the center of culture during the late Renaissance? Identify two leading painters from the city. Venice, and two of those painters would be Titian and Tintoretto. Identify Northern Renaissance artists for each of the following: portrait painting, genre painting, wood carvings and engravings, detailed realism through oil painting. Okay, so for portrait, Holbein; genre painting, Bruegel; wood carving, Dürer; oil painting, Van Eyck. Who was the most famous composer of church music during the Renaissance, and what type of music did he master? That would be Palestrina and polyphonic music. Okay, here are your focus words: art, evolve, masterpieces. Your bonus question for your section 2 and 3 quiz, I'm going to ask you guys, how many typos did I mention in the presentation for section 2 and 3? Do not go through the slideshow trying to find typos. You're only caring about how many I actually talk about in the slideshow. And I'll give you an answer at the end of this section 3. Okay, so consequences of the Renaissance. Positive consequences. People develop a spirit of inquiry. They want to question everything. They want to know about the world. They want to know about religion, art, okay? There's a revived interest in the literature and languages of antiquity, including biblical texts. They develop movable type printing, so now many people can read things. We can produce manuscripts more easily and in a cheaper way. And it's easier for us to get ideas to move because we have movable type printing. Education is more widely available, and the importance of the individual is stressed. And this is important when we get to the Reformation and people making personal decisions to follow Christ rather than depending on the church as a group. Okay, negative consequences would include the secular emphasis weakened moral restraints and made the need for reform more apparent, but people are acting very immoral. Remember what I said kind of about Venice. And the church has become very greedy and corrupt, which is, we've seen that begin during the Middle Ages as well.